We've got friends from St. Olaf, from Luther, from the larger community, from Hennepin, from United. We're just grateful, and I probably missed somebody, but we are so grateful to have you here. The Picard Lectures have an interesting history here. One of our alums in 2002 set up the Picard Lectures. Frank Picard did, basically to honor his family's great investment in ecological sensitivities, but because he thought at a seminary, we ought to talk about what are the spiritual implications of our relationship to nature. He always used the word creation, which of course is already a theological statement. But tonight we talk about nature, creation, spirituality, and how we as persons who care deeply should reflect on these days. It's an urgent time, as we know. This past week, our students held in this room this wonderful service of lament as we think about how we care for creation and what is dying because we don't care enough. And so tonight we have a wonderful person to offer these lectures, and the dean, Dr. Kyle Roberts, will introduce Dr. Jorgenson and the respondents. Welcome.
So great to see all of you here tonight for this important occasion in the life of United, the Picard Lecture on Environment and Theology. Well, welcome to United. President Marshall already said welcome, but I will again. United is very interested in the intersection of the environment and religion, the environment and theology. We established a few years ago the Eco-Justice program, an MA in Eco-Justice, largely in response to student interest. In fact, in good student form, a petition by students who wanted us to start a program, such a program, recognizing the importance of this issue for our time. If that's something that interests any of you, we have a booth back there and someone right there willing to talk with you about it, Mallory. So I also want to just thank those of us, those also who are joining online. But let me briefly now introduce our Picard lecturer for this year, whom we were able to draw out of a sabbatical. And academics know how tough that can be. So Dr. Kiara Jorgensen, a theologian by training, Kiara earned degrees from St. Olaf College, Denver Seminary, and Luther Seminary, her PhD. Her research interests include Protestant ecotheologies, vocation, ecofeminisms, agrarian studies, ecological resistance movements, childhood studies, and the theology of motherwork. She teaches religion courses on ecotheologies, place-based spiritualities, and a smattering of environmental humanities offerings such as biophilia, theoethics of climate change, and culture of nature. Kiara recently published Ecology of Vocation, Recasting Calling in a New Planetary Era, and an edited volume, Ecotheology, A Christian Conversation, and more works to come. We're told are on their way. We're also delighted to welcome two respondents who will be offering brief reflections on Dr. Jorgensen's remarks, and then we'll have some time for audience Q&A. Those respondents are Dr. Timothy Eberhart, who's here with us right there. Timothy is the Robert and Marilyn Degler McLean Associate Professor of Ecological Theology and Practice and the Director of the Center for Ecological Regeneration of Garrett Seminary. He has a BA from St. Olaf and a PhD from Vanderbilt University. Dr. Munjed Murad, back there, is our United's Assistant Professor of World Religions and Intercultural Studies, supported by the Johnson Fry Endowment, and is our Program Director for Eco-Justice. Munjed has a doctorate of theology from Harvard Divinity School, Master of Environmental Management from Yale School of the Environment, and then a bachelor's from George Washington University. Believe we're in for a wonderful conversation tonight, so I will stop talking and I will hand it over to Dr. Kiara Jorgensen. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Molly and Kyle, for the warm invitation and welcome. Munjed and Tim partnering in this tonight. I appreciate it. And thanks to all of you who are joining here and online. It's just a real privilege to be a part of this community. I come to you from St. Olaf College, where I serve on the faculty in 2 departments, religion and environmental studies. Great nexus between those disciplines. And every fall, when I'm not on sabbatical, I have had the opportunity to teach a capstone course for our environmental studies seniors. And in that course, we ask students to craft an eco-narrative, personal environmental narrative, to think about their emergent sense of relatedness to Earth. And as a part of that, we offer prompts for them to think about their childhood selves. I love that part of teaching the course, in part because I am a scholar of childhood studies and I'm a parent. And so it's just really a rich opportunity for us to think about Earth and our relationship to Earth from a very young age. So as I was preparing remarks tonight, I was thinking about my own childhood narratives and my experience as a mom. And I asked my youngest child if I could share one of her stories with you, and she consented. So I'm going to tell you a little story about my now 8-year-old who, when she was 6 at the time, we were waiting to be seated at a very busy restaurant on a Friday night. And rather than standing in the busy lobby, we went outside and time was passing. She was patient that particular day. And all of a sudden I looked down and she had big tears in her eyes. I said, "Ingrid, what's going on?" She looked at me, shifted her gaze to one of anger, and said, "You know exactly what's going on." No, I don't. I probed a little further. And with a sternness and a resolution about her tone, she said, "All these cars, they just keep coming by. Don't they know the ice is melting and the baby bears are going to die?" And we're in the middle of a public place, right? So, and I can feel my jaw clenching and I'm blinking a bunch and I'm checking to see how many cars are coming by, lest my 6-year-old activist see it as a good idea to lund herself in front of said cars. And I turned to offer some statement, right, to placate her in some way. And she had already moved on. She already wiped her face off, was heading in to get that bowl of much anticipated mac and cheese. These kind of conversations, I've been writing them down. They continue to emerge. I had a similar one with my older daughter a couple seasons back when the apple trees that we planted on her first birthday didn't bear fruit because of invasive species that no longer die off during our warm winters. And she weeps, she cries when the apples don't come. I think in their own ways, with their own words, children are finding their way in this world, as you and I are, trying to conjure up hope in the midst of a lot of tears. And I find children really exemplary in their capacity to honor the complexity of feelings and through their demands for a hope that is honest and more than just talk. And this is what I want to speak with you about tonight. In light of widespread ecological rupture everywhere we look, what is hope really? I'm going to limit my discussion of hope to the Christian tradition because it's the religious heritage with which I'm most familiar. But in our responses tonight, and I hope in the conversation that lingers, I anticipate there will be meaningful connections to other faith traditions, because when it comes to the well-being of our planet, interfaith collaboration has never been more pressing. So to begin, I want to offer you a 2 brief account of variations on on themes of Christian hope. And I'm going to do that by using a schema set forth by the late theologian of hope, one of my favorites, Jürgen Moltmann. Moltmann helps us consider hope in 3 different modes. First, hope can be a force or an energy in the face of something else, defined by what it presses against, say lethargy, despair, resignation. In this way, we could think of hope as a kind of resistance, right? And second, hope can be a sober recognition of what is but should not be. And this is because mourning requires vision of what could have been. So hope is also lament. And third, hope can be rejoicing in the promises of God, which come to us from the future. Hope is therefore a posture, it's an outlook, it's a way of orienting oneself. And I think when it comes to the Christian life, all 3 of these manifestations are true to our lived experience, just as the Gospels say they were true to Christ's human experience. We protest, we weep, we fall into joy. I had the opportunity to preach on Easter Sunday on the Gospel of John many years ago. And I took a deep dive into looking at Mary's response. And I think Mary enacts all 3 of these modes of hope on Easter alone. First, in coming to the tomb, hoping against hope, and then crying out of sadness and despair, and finally sharing her joy after encountering the risen Lord. But whether it's for us or for Mary, let us notice how in all 3 modes of hope, hope is active. It's not passive. Hope is something we do. It's not something we have. Moltmann puts it this way, that hope awakens our sense of potentiality for what could be. In concrete action, we always relate the potentiality to what exists, the present to the future. If our actions are only directed to the future, we should fall victim to utopias. But if they're only related to the present, we miss our chances. I love his turn of phrase here. So cultivating hope then is a holy practice. And this, friends, means that practicing lament is a holy practice. I think this is why many of the monastics referred to pain, suffering, and loss as the gift of tears. 2 of my personal favorites from the medieval period, Hildegard of Bingen and Julian of Norwich, were well acquainted with sorrow. Hildegard spoke of her chronic illness as a portal to the spirit, who is accessible in the liveliness of the world. And likewise, Julian described her extraordinary suffering as property of divine love for the ways that it transformed her attention. Scholar of Christian mysticism Douglas Christie shares this really helpful insight, and I want to quote him at length here as we look at one of Hildegard's beautiful illustrations. He says this: "The early Christian monastics knew that tears could break open the soul, kindling a deeper awareness of one's vulnerability and fragility and one's capacity for intimacy with God and all living beings. But opening oneself in this way required courage, a willingness to face one's own fragility, as well as the fragility and the brokenness of the world. Weeping, when understood as a part of a conscious Christian spiritual practice, had the capacity to flood the soul with an awareness of intricacy, beauty, and spiritual value of all existence." Now, interestingly, threads within contemporary neuroscience make very analogous claims, as we now know that our nervous systems are not just resilient in the face of hardship, but rather anti-fragile. That is, our bodies and our nervous systems need adversity to develop properly. They are anti-fragile. So in my remarks this evening, I'll suggest that negative affects, such as grief, are not just the opposite of hope. They are critical ingredients for a robust hope, one that is anti-fragile and able to open us to greater intimacy within all of creation. And Christian communities, therefore, must reclaim hope as active lament to creatively reimagine a planetary future where all can flourish. So to make this case, I'm going to cover the following territory, at least attempt to. First, I'm going to invite you to join me in an honest assessment of our place in time. As I've articulated in my first book, Ecology of Vocation, we are not just called to particular roles or forms of work or even to places. We are called to a particular time in history. So we need to understand our context well. And second, I want to share some bad news with you. Not because you need more cause for anxiety or suffering, but because I think we find a lot of common ground in our responses to those things. And from a Christian perspective, we might say we encounter God in and through those things. And third, I'll end by sharing just a little bit of my recent research on Christian worship to demonstrate how greater attention to liturgical formation can help us grow hope through tears. So you ready? All right, let's talk about our place in time first. Transdisciplinary consensus among practitioners and scholars is, and we know this, you're here tonight, that our species is irrevocably changing Earth's body and systems. And we've heard this story for a long time, although disciplines demarcate the effects in various ways. In climatology circles, we've heard about global warming. Biologists discuss the proposed sixth mass extinction. And in the 21st century, some geologists began using this term, Anthropocene or Anthropocene, if you're on the other side of the Atlantic, a concept that refers to the large-scale changes that Earth experiences as a result of human behavior. It is worth noting that this term is contested on almost every ground possible. Many say the term is not incisive enough, that Capitalocene is a better alternative for the ways that that word, Capitalocene, exposes our exploitative and extractive socio and economic systems. But there are many other alternatives out there since the year 2001. I'll let you browse and look at these for a moment. For you Swifties out there, there's one right here for sure. This is a total buzzkill kind of eras tour, right? Nothing fun about this. But just think about how we're describing this time we live in, right? The words we're using. I think no matter what term we use, there is a shared understanding here that we are living in a new time and we must find novel ways to exist. There is no going back. And this is what Catholic ecotheologian Thomas Berry called the great work of our generations. So what does it mean to live well in a new time? Well, as potent as that question is, it's not a new one in Christian thought. Christian thinkers have long distinguished between different kinds of time, right? Chronos time being the tick, 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 kind of the linear approach to time, versus kairos time being that phenomenological burst of time that's changed by a new reality. A good example of this is the 2023 ELCA social message on climate change. It's literally entitled Our Kairos Moment. I had a chance to work on the team that put this together. And the document starts by saying, quote, climate change presses humanity with a kairos moment, that is a critical moment in time when God is leading us into decisive action. Thinking about time in that way. And I would say, in addition to exploring nuances on how we think about time, Christian theology must also consider biblical notions of apocalyptic times in the Jewish Tanakh and the Greek New Testament. Many of us likely know that apocalypto is not synonymous with catastrophe, nor does it define a dreadful future, although lots of cultural references and mainstream media sources might have us think so. And I love these films. I'll just admit. But apocalypto literally means to lift the veil. I always tell my students, think Wizard of Oz, who's behind the curtain, you know? And it reveals the truth. So living in a time of apocalypse means to see or at least begin to see things for how they truly are. Think of it as a threshold. It's an occasion which often calls for a reckoning with hard truths. In this sense, I think it's fair to say we're living in an apocalypse now. But plenty of Christian theology would have us think that this reckoning won't come until the end, capital E, end. Notwithstanding that Christian discourse on eschatology is far from homogeneous, past and present, but so much contemporary Christian thought skirts the hard stuff. And it charges Christians to simply fix our eyes on Jesus. Cheap construals of hope attempt to drown out moans of pain. We read about that in Romans 8, the groaning of creation itself, shouts of fear, and attempts to drown these out with louder plenitudes of a promised new heaven and new earth. But this is thin theology, and it's not anti-fragile. What's more, these popular Christian theologies don't honor the scriptural traditions they so fiercely seek to preserve, as the Bible is replete with references to the triune God in earth through the Spirit's immanence and Christ's embodied cosmic presence. To give us a sense of this pervasive problem and move us toward a thicker understanding of hope, I want to make a few observations about a common contemporary source of theology, Christian pop radio. I tell my students I listen to Christian pop radio all the time because it's teaching fodder, right? And this song was a top on Christian hit Billboard for many weeks some years ago by the group Building 429. I'm not going to read all the verses to you, but what I am going to do is highlight a couple of things. So first of all, look at the first stanza with me and the last line of it, and note the implicit epistemological claims being made here. I will keep searching for answers that are not here to find. In practice, this asserts that Christian faith is in tension with, if not pitted against, the pursuit of knowledge. What's the takeaway? Well, that quote unquote worldly forms of knowledge don't ultimately lead to hope. Second, notice in a song like this, the lyrics, take this world, this is not where I belong, repeated, how the self is separate from the world. And third, notice this bit about blessed assurance at the end of stanza 3. A clear reference to salvation yet to come. In short, this song and so many like it purport knowledge as uniquely Christian, the self as above the world, or at least separate from it, and salvation as detached from daily life. So just think with me, many of you no doubt have already. How do these theologies shape ecological consciousness and behavior? Because they do, and as I've already said, they are everywhere. Jürgen Moltmann had it right when he said, every Christian ethics is determined by a presupposed eschatology. That is, Christian moral norms are shaped by what Christians believe will take place in the end. But as the late South African theologian J.F. Durand argued, the church may never practice futurology. The church is a bearer of hope, yes, but never such that it calculates or promises what will happen. This is because God is in the future and comes to us full of surprises. Therefore, what is assured is not salvation on a new planet or in a new realm, but rather the presence of God itself. So how does the Christian best understand God's presence? But by way of the cross. In Durand's word, the church becomes the bearer of this hope by sharing in the suffering and the need of the downtrodden, the marginalized, the oppressed. Other majority world liberation theologians like the beloved Gustavo Gutierrez, who our world just lost this week, have made similar claims and challenged Christian theology to start with the question, where are we now? Writing in the mid-1980s, Durand was particularly interested in human suffering under the regime of apartheid. But as I have discussed in some of my other writing, Christian solidarity with the oppressed must not be limited to the human realm, because you and I are nature. We are intricately tangled up with the materiality of others, be they rocks or microbes, be they plants or technologies, animals or humans. So sharing and suffering must extend beyond our social relations. And this is really key, because historically, Christian theology has been incredibly anthropocentric in scope, even if not all bad, as is the case with stewardship of land theologies that call humans to be better caretakers of earth. But Christian theology, as we know, has long upheld Neoplatonic distinctions between subject, read human, and object, read everything else. Recent iterations of Christian theologies, we see the same trope, the same kind of framework, focusing either on the social ramifications of ecological rupture or the so-called environmental impacts upon land, animal welfare, etc. Too few Christian theologies expansively consider the interrelated suffering of Earth and Earth's people. But for our Christian communities to cultivate anti-fragile hope and live into it, we need to peel back the curtain, acknowledge this Kairos moment, and see things for how they really are. And that's why this work must be transdisciplinary in nature. So that leads me to the second piece I want to talk about this evening. That's the bad news that I promised I'd deliver. And I hate to say it, there's no lack of it. And we could talk, whole semester long about this, right? I'm going to limit things, though, to a summation of recent reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And to be fair, we shouldn't equivocate climate change with ecological decline. Climate change is a part of that puzzle, yes, but of course it includes consideration of planetary boundaries like biodiversity loss, pollution, ocean acidification, deforestation, et cetera. Sometimes we get too micro on the climate change. We need to remember that bigger picture, I think. As philosopher Stephen Gardner says, climate change is the perfect moral storm. And he says this because it's not a local problem, it's a global one. It's dispersive, so it's harder to address. It's also intergenerational. So that makes moral culpability and agency difficult to pinpoint. Climate change makes all of those other environmental challenges I just mentioned more intense. It is, as my friend, evangelical scientist Catherine Hayhoe says, it is a threat multiplier. A threat multiplier. So that's why I want to talk about it with you tonight. So since its first assessment cycle began in 1988, the IPCC has produced 6 major reports, currently in its 7th cycle of study. And I don't know how many of you are following this, but I'm really pleased to see that the panel is including more diverse forms of knowledge as of late. At the 61st session of the IPCC in Bulgaria just this past summer, the panel adopted a decision to include more research methodologies, including, quote, regional approaches, indigenous knowledge, practitioner expertise, and city networks. This is a win, I think, for our planet, for our species. It does take a big tent of ideas and ways of knowing to address our present challenges. So the IPCC reports inform decision makers as they craft future practices and policies. But to do this work well, the panel also includes a deep look backwards. The IPCC's stated mission is, quote, to understand and learn from past global climate hazards, crises, and socioeconomic developments. So I get excited about this as a theologian, because while the IPCC is not theologically inclined, serious attention to the pain of the past is foregrounded in its suggestions for the future. This principle of hope through tears applies even in the analysis of big data. So on the screen, I'm going to show you the hockey stick graphs. Dun, dun, dun. They are produced by the International Geosphere Biosphere Program, which is a group that supports the work of the IPCC. And You probably can't see this, especially if you, those online, but the graphs begin with the conventional date for the onset of the Industrial Revolution on the left, 1750. And as you can see, these graphs measure widely disparate subjects, but what is clear visibly is acceleration across the board. And if we were going to put them one on top of another, what we would see is a really acute hockey stick launch up beginning with the year 1950 in particular. The IPCC's most recent formal report warns us about this, that global surface temperature will continue to increase until the mid-century under all emission scenarios considered. Global warming of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius will be exceeded during the 21st century unless deep reductions in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases emissions occur in coming decades. Practically speaking, I want to highlight a couple of key things, pulling them out of a lot of reports. This is what this means for humans by the year 2040, not for baby polar bears or apple trees, but for humans. And let's not forget there's impacts for the rest of Earth. It means, first of all, the first bullet here, that there will be irreversible loss of the Greenland ice sheet. It's going to lead to unprecedented rises in sea levels, and it's going to devastate life on coastal areas and islands. It already is. Second, 6% of insects, 8% of plants, 4% of vertebrates are estimated to lose half of their native geographic range. And this is just going to be long-term species lost, all sorts of human impacts when we think about that. Third, net production of cereal crops like maize, rice, and wheat will decrease while food scarcity increases, especially on the continent of Africa. Fourth, vector-borne diseases like malaria and dengue fever will increase and are going to impact populations in a much more expansive geographical range. And lastly, just to sum some things up, the poorest countries, of course, in the tropics and southern hemisphere subtropics are going to bear the brunt of that economic decline in relation to the rising costs of climate adaptation. So, we encounter these statistics all the time in environmental studies. We're reading this information, and my already clear case of the green blues worsens kind of a little bit every time. And I work with young adults in an undergraduate setting, so I'm very aware, growing even more aware of the psychological impacts of this bad news upon those young people. Now entering our 21st century lexicon are terms that speak to this. Terms like climate anxiety, eco-anxiety, solastalgia, environmental grief, psychoterrotic syndromes. The American Psychological Association's report, Mental Health and Our Changing Climate, defines eco-anxiety as, quote, chronic fear of environmental doom. My friend, practical theologian Joyce Ann Mercer, notes that these concepts arose to characterize the range of human emotional responses that include high levels of worry, fear, despair, sorrow, grief, depression, and existential anxiety felt in relation to ecological destruction and environmentally related stressors. My 6-year-old, she didn't know about polar bears from me. She heard about it from a friend on the playground and then had to talk about it a week later and then a couple months later. It's just kind of living in there, right? Stanford University's Center for Innovation and Global Health is leading some of these studies. And one of its fellows, Britt Ray, who's the author of a great book, highly recommend you read it, called Generation Dread, co-authored the largest ever survey of eco-anxiety in teenagers and young adults. The results show that 46% of Gen Z, that's people ages 16 to 25, believe that their daily lives are negatively impacted by eco-anxiety. And those who regularly use social media experience this doom even more intensely. But when Ray was asked how she personally feels about this bad news, she said this, and I wanted to quote her at length because I find this compelling. She says, it's sad to hold the statistic in your heart and realize what it means that so many people are walking around feeling that way about their own future. But I don't think they're overreacting. They are seeing things getting worse and harder. And there it is, right? That's the veil being pulled back, finally starting to talk about things for how they really are. She goes on, grief comes from a deep state of caring. These emotions are a sign of our connection to things that are beyond ourselves, to other species, wild places, generations yet unborn, and vulnerable communities that will be impacted the worst. It's actually a very good thing. And anger can be hugely motivating. When it's based on a real sense of injustice, it does show that your conscience is alive and your sense of being morally transgressed is intact. It can breed a very deep well of strength from which to act. So loss and grief, worry and anger, these are not deficits, things to get over quickly or beyond. They can fuel a revolution. They're essential to what Buddhist Joanna Macy calls the work that reconnects. And I want to try something a little unorthodox for an academic lecture and invite you to join me in a body practice. This is something I've been doing more in my classroom, and students are asking for more of it, honestly. And the reason we do it in class, we're engaging texts, we're looking at data, but we also know that our bodies give us really important information about the world and hold knowledge. So Macy's team talks about honoring pain and grief as a critical part of our journey, and it's a cycle, it's a spiral. We never stop with that work. So I'd like us to take a moment, whether you're online or here in person, to just try this out. Try this out. We often do body practices with people we know well and have trust. So we'll do this more privately today. But if you're here and you're comfortable, I encourage you to stand and kind of shake out your shoulders. Prepare your body. And you see an image on the screen here. Some of you may know 4 square breathing. If you look on the left-hand side where the arrow's pointing up, we're going to breathe in for 4 seconds. And then the top of the square, we're going to hold our breath for 4. The right-hand side, we're going to breathe out for 4. And the bottom of the square, we're going to hold our breath for 4. So that's the idea. And I'll count as we do that. We're going to add a layer to this, though, in thinking about naming and honoring loved things that are dying, loved things that are going away, things that we are losing. So I'm going to ask all of you, online or here, to just imagine a beloved place. What's a place on earth that you cherish? I bet you have it already. Don't overthink it. And as we start this practice, we'll do it 2 times through. What we're going to do is, as we breathe in for 4, we're going to name that place. Name it in whatever way you want. Do you know the biome? Do you know the indigenous name for that place? Did you call it something when you were a child, right? Name it in whatever way you want. And when we get to the top of the square, we're going to hold our breath for 4. And I want you to just think about, what do you know about that place? What creatures abide there? What trees are native to that place? What glaciers created the rock and the formations of that place? What do you know? As we breathe out for 4, I'm going to ask you to recall a memory that you have in that place. And then we're going to hold for 4 and just tune in to what feeling comes to mind as you recall that place. Okay? I'll remind you subtly what we're doing for each 4 and count. Feel free to close your eyes if you want, or look at the screen if it helps you, but we'll cycle through this 2 times. Let's begin. Let's name for breathing in for 1, 2, 3, 4. We're knowing and holding for 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathing out and remembering 1, 2, 3, 4. We're holding and feeling 1, 2, 3, 4. A little slower, back to breathing in and naming 1, 2, 3, 4. holding, knowing, 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathing out, 1 with a memory, 2, 3, 4, and holding, feeling, 1, 2, 3, 4. When you're ready, feel free to open your eyes, stretch your body, and have a seat. Have a seat. Now, we would normally do this exercise many times, as I said, with people with whom we're already acquainted. And in class, we might take time to sit down and just jot some thoughts down on what parts of the cycle maybe came easiest, what were hardest, and why. Or maybe we would turn to a neighbor and talk about that. I think these kinds of practices, and by the way, that the book, Coming Back to Life, Joanna Macy's piece, is full of practices like this if you're interested in learning more. But these kinds of mindfulness exercises and body practices should be included in the context of Christian worship. And this leads me to this final area that I want to talk about tonight, how we can grow liturgy, how we can grow hope, rather, through tears by using liturgy and reclaiming liturgy. United's Theological Seminary's mission, I looked online, is to prepare innovative and compassionate leaders for equipping of churches, faith communities, and society toward justice and peace. So many of you here tonight and listening online are training to lead communities of faith and worship, or you're already leading communities of faith and worship. I would argue that probably all of us, in some way or another, have encountered spaces of worship and shaped by them for better or for worse. And in seminary settings like this, I'm a seminarian, I did an MDiv as well. I think there can be this assumption that theological study has to come before one crafts and leads settings of worship. But the act of worship is theology. And liturgy is that of worshiping communities, whether it's formal or not. It is the theological expression of the people. As my mentor, Reverend Kelly Chapman, taught me, my first church gig out of undergrad, the what of our worship communicates a great deal about the why. The what of our worship communicates a great deal about the why. While it may seem stale and prescribed in certain contexts, liturgy has always been the work of God's people. Liturgies of old often offer insight into these 3 modes of hope that Moltmann articulated and that Mary Magdalene lived out. So because it's right around the corner, I know my Lutheran clergy colleagues are thinking about it, that is Advent. I want to talk specifically about Advent for a second. Advent, Adventus, meaning the coming or the arrival, kicks off the Christian year with an offering of hope. Did you know that? Hope as a first fruit. In ancient agrarian societies, like those described in the Torah, families were obligated to offer first fruits. Even if blight came tomorrow, harvest was offered today. And this too is the principle of Advent, that hope is offered today, even if tomorrow is bleak. In ancient times, first fruits were also offered before a host of witnesses, and this is also the case in Christian Advent liturgies. Hope isn't offered alone. We can't do it alone. Hope is offered up by a collective. It can be tentative hope. It can be bold and brazen hope. What matters is not exactly what a person puts their hope in or what they hope for. What makes the first fruits of Advent powerful is the doing of it, the act of hope itself. So here again, that theme of hope as active, not passive, rings true. Hope, having it, has less to do with waiting for external agencies, even God, and more to do with what we desire by acting upon it. What would we like to see redeemed? In many liturgical traditions in this hemisphere, it's customary to darn our sanctuaries with indigo and cobalt paraments, right, to symbolize those deep, dark, expansive skies of winter. And the light of Advent that is to come on Christmas Eve serves as a reminder that darkness doesn't have the final story, that light, even in some small measure, shall prevail. Some of you may have a tradition. Our family practices this during Advent of lighting candles during the Advent season. And traditionally, Christians light 4, one for each of the weeks of Advent. And the deliberate order of these earthen artifacts reflect the promise of Christmas. And I love this, in what medieval Benedictine Bernard of Clairvaux first referred to as the 3 comings of the Lord. He said, yes, Christ comes to us first in the flesh of Bethlehem, but also in our hearts daily and eventually in glory at the end of time. So Advent, then, is a season to anticipate Christ's presence in all 3 of those comings. And likewise, Christmas is about preparing to celebrate Christ's presence year-round. In some worship settings, the candle that's lit on the 3rd Sunday of Advent is pink. You see that here? And that signifies Gaudete Sunday, or the Sunday of rejoicing in love. The day and the spoken liturgy takes its common name from the Latin word for rejoice, as referenced in the 4th chapter of the Philippian epistle. The Apostle Paul writes, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say it, rejoice. Let your forbearance be known to all, for the Lord is near at hand. Therefore, have no anxiety about anything, but in all things by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God. So historically, this 3rd Sunday, this pink Gaudete Sunday, marks the time where Christians turn in the first 2 weeks of Advent from a posture of soberness and solemnity. Did you know that? That the first 2 weeks of Advent are more akin to Lent. And it's not till this 3rd Sunday where there's a shift to expectation and delight. The love and the joy that's characteristic of the last 2 weeks of Advent and Christmas, in other words, is foregrounded by a recognition of pain, suffering, and loss. That's how the liturgy works, whether we know that or not. There's a reckoning with grief. And I think Christian communities can uphold these liturgical seasons and enact rituals related to them in meaningful ways, but it's imperative that we acknowledge where we begin with this, because not all of us come to the business of hope from the same place. The emotional currency that folks spend to act in hope is not drawn from equal coffers. As I try to listen well to those who have personally experienced generational environmental racism and those who are trying to breathe under the slow lynching of climate violence, I would say that hope looks a little more like mitigation than celebration. I think for a lot of those people, hope is more like making reparations than party celebrations. And so a question I want to raise tonight, and that I'm asking myself as a clergywoman and as a Christian, is can our liturgies speak more honestly about this? Can they make space for the tears of particular peoples? Because they ought to. Scholar of liturgical theologies and ritual, Claudio Carvalles, puts it this way, that the task of public liturgical theology is to honor God and each other, restituting those who were stolen from, giving possession to the dispossessed, bringing life to those who are dead, and giving justice and peace to situations of inequality and despair. If this is true, then liturgies should not be confined to poems published in clerical books. As Twin Cities-based liturgist Reverend Metta Carlson Herrick says, most of our liturgies are hyper-local, and they're rarely known outside the context in which they were written. And I would add to this that liturgies are authored by the priesthood of all believers in settings like youth slam poetry competitions, community gardens, hospice rooms, prison cells. What counts as liturgy? To enact hope as lament, we need to expand our understanding of worship, our definitions of liturgy, and we need to allow more voices to thicken our understanding of hope by sharing their pain. Reverend Carlson Herrick recently published a really fine example, I think, of a place-based liturgy that honors God and seeks to empower the dispossessed. And so I'm going to invite you to join me in reading one of those. This is a piece from a larger collection called The Peace of the Prairie, a liturgy for here and now, and it was a project commissioned by Shalom Hill Farm in Windham, Minnesota. So let's stand up again, shall we? One more time. And as I read this, please, if you feel comfortable, join me in reading the bold "We Remember." The Christian faith asks us to hold many truths in tension with one another. We plant our feet on Dakota land, on layers of soil and stories, and acknowledge that people and places contain multitudes. We remember the generous gifts of creation and God's promise of enough. We remember glacial melt, the birth pangs of prairie, ancestors singing, water is life. We remember acres sold and treaties breaking, settlers unsettling and systems taking. We remember the legacy and the loss of bison, of nations oppressed and removed. We remember the isolation of immigration, homesteads far from new neighbors in old country. We remember Dakota people already and not yet, and resilient voices in this generation. We remember farmers who labor to feed the world, who know wind and weather in their bones. We remember the call to turn from the myth of scarcity to interrupt patterns of harm with justice. We remember we belong to each other and to this land, all relations of the God who remembers. Remember us, O God. Amen. You may be seated. So when it comes to this radical and active hope, this work that liturgical formation can do, I think it does demand more of our time, more of our attention. And I'm going to end by saying 3 things I think that liturgies can do for us as we seek to enact hope through tears. First, liturgies like the one we just shared in, we remember, they help us name what has been lost. Second, they help us remember and count the cost of that loss, or at least they can do that. And finally, liturgies can call upon the collective to repair what's been lost. Just a brief couple comments about each. When it comes to the naming what has been lost, famed and beloved environmental activist Aldo Leopold rightly said, "We will only grieve for what we know." And while we know more than ever about the anthropogenic causes of climate change, research shows that we also lack the embodied knowledge to respond. And this is where the arts and humanities play such a critical role for us. These traditions have a great deal to say about the experiential and aesthetic ways of knowing. As my own students at St. Olaf have learned in recent years, it is one thing to explain the effects of a leaky Enbridge oil pipe to those who are distant from the Lake Superior watershed, but it is quite another to reflect on the related diminished spiritual practices of Anishinaabeg people who depend upon the integrity of those sacred waters. So if naming loss requires intimate knowledge of what is lost, as Leopold suggests, then we best pay close attention to the very place in which we find ourselves and try to foster greater affection for it. Liturgies can help us do that. Second, the enactment of hope requires the remembrance of loss. In their groundbreaking work on grief, German psychologists Marguerite and Alexander Mitscherlich investigated why the majority of World War II, post-World War II Germans were unable to grapple with and mourn the loss and destruction that they had endured and inflicted upon others. Their study concluded that when denial and repression of painful memory exists, the compulsion to repeat those harmful acts is more likely. Another way of saying this, in other words, is to heal, we humans need to remember what has been broken. We need to talk about it often and share those memories together. For hope to grow, we need to participate in that holy task of witnessing what has been destroyed. And I think liturgies can help us do that also. And finally, liturgies can provide insight into how we might begin and sustain efforts toward repair. And in all honesty, I think Christian liturgies have largely failed to do this, because we've crafted spaces of worship for the church rather than for the world. But the church does face a kairos moment. It's an apocalypse pregnant with potential. And there is an opportunity to work toward the common good for all creation. So to name and remember the loss, yes, but also to heal. And this is a worthy vision for Christians the world over. And to get there, the church must cultivate this holy practice of lament. It must heed the times and construct anti-fragile theologies that center the voices of the afflicted, especially, I would argue, those of children and youth. Thin and cheap hope packed in false futures and fake gospels leave us wanting under the weight of an increasingly hot and weird planet. So what we need now is collective prophetic imagination of a people who are fueled by a thick and lasting hope, a hope that is characterized by the gift of tears. Thank you.
First, let me express my gratitude to United Theological Seminary for the invitation to respond to Dr. Jorgensen's poignant lecture. It was, in fact, in my very first semester at St. Olaf College in the fall of 1991, in a first-year English class, that I was first introduced to nature writers like Annie Dillard and Wendell Berry and Gretel Ehrlich. And it was in the final semester of my senior year as a religion major, spring of 1995, almost 30 years ago, in a course on feminist spiritualities, where I first came across ecotheology and eco-spirituality in a volume edited by Judith Plaskow and Carol Christ. This was not long after the Reimagining conference that United played such a key role in. A conference which played no small part in my ending up attending Vanderbilt Divinity School, where I was able to study and learn from ecofeminist Sally McFaig, which is not unrelated to my ending up at Garrett, where I teach eco-theology at a seminary where Rosemary Radford Ruther taught for many years, which is probably why I enjoy working with folk like Elizabeth Macaulay and Nancy Victor and Van Grood as much as I do. All that to say, I could not be more thankful for schools like St. Olaf and United, which for decades have been leading the way in nurturing the kind of life-giving, justice-committed, new directions seeking theological visions that are so urgently needed today. There is so much I could reflect on from the lecture, but let me start where Dr. Jorgensen began and speak first as a parent. Our oldest, Henry, is now 22. When he was a sophomore in high school 6 years ago, he and I had the following exchange, which I shared on Facebook with his permission. October 22nd, 2018. Having just read several more articles this morning on the state of the climate and the grim implications, I see Henry putting on his shoes to head out the door for school. Me. How's your day look? Henry. Fine. I should be home from school right after. Me. Hey, are folks in your circles talking about the latest climate report? What, the IPCC report? Yeah. We're aware of it. What are you all thinking? Well, there's nothing really new, at least in terms of the science. Me. No, not really. Just that the scientific community is raising more alarm. Henry, walking out the door, looking at me with a smile altogether real and forced. It's not working. Me, no. Henry, see you, Dad. Fast forward, early fall 2021, the 6th IPCC assessment report has just come out, and I get a text from Henry linking to the news release. Quote, I guess our generation can throw away those lists of favorite baby names. Oof. Just this past spring, Henry graduated with a double major in Native American and environmental studies, and his senior thesis, which focused on the work of buffalo revitalization as a means of revitalizing Lakota culture, was based on his time spent last summer on a buffalo ranch on the Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation in western South Dakota. On his wall, opposite his writing desk, Henry had posted a quote from Billy Ray Belcourt, age 29, a favorite Native author of his. The future is already over, but that doesn't mean we don't have anywhere else to go. The future is already over, but that doesn't mean we don't have anywhere else to go. It reminded me of something my St. Olaf religion professor, Charlie Wilson, once said, I think in reference to Kierkegaard. He said, the hope the Christian faith witnesses to is a hope that is born where there is no hope. My sense is that many of our young people have been walking in the way of grief and despair for some time, acutely aware that certain futures are already over for them. And with a kind of resilient tenacity, are now seeking somewhere else to go. And what's painfully clear to this ordained minister and theologian is that most have not found resources helpful to them in the Christian tradition, at least in its dominant expressions. They are looking elsewhere. So in this time of ecological rupture, of planetary civilizational apocalypse, here's one of my hopes. That those of us presently responsible for our religious traditions and their institutions would follow Dr. Jorgensen's call by meeting our young people in their grief. And in many ways, that will mean catching up to them by lamenting the futures that will not be, that are already over for ourselves, for our faith communities, for our institutions of higher education. Because as ecofeminist and process theologian Catherine Keller reminds us, drawing on the wisdom of the mystical traditions, when we allow the grief process to flow and not stay dammed up, we can then reconnect with the primordial waters of creation, out of which, from which new life can emerge. Then, perhaps only then, we might just find that there are other places for us to go. Then, to draw on womanist witness, a way out of no way might yet emerge. Sophia herself, the great mother bird of creation, to speak with eco-theologian Mark Wallace, hovering over the deep waters of our collective tears, might yet give birth to a future not yet imagined. Concretely, I very much hope gatherings like this one proliferate. Ongoing, sustained conversations and collaborations between seminaries, colleges, centers, degree programs, congregations, Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, environmental activists and organizations, tribal communities, grassroots movements, campus protest movements. Some of us speaking less, others speaking more, but all of us ultimately sharing in, yes, collective lament. And then in a great reimagining of all our traditions, joining in solidarity with our children and youth and generations yet to come, joining in a great liturgy of plant, animal, soil, water, and air revitalization, a great practice of financial, institutional, and terrestrial reparations, and a great prayer of deep spiritual, cultural rebirth that I believe is waiting for us, is laboring through us with tears and with eager longing. So Dr. Jorgensen, thank you for inviting us to weep and to hope. Let's join her call.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the All-Merciful, the All-Compassionate, I invoke the sacred formula which all Muslims begin anything worth beginning in the name of God. May that be all that we do. Thank you to Dr. Jorgensen for speaking here to us, for enriching the eco-justice program we offer here at United with her words of wisdom. Thank you to Dr. Eberhart for responding and making it harder, even harder for me to respond. My goodness, Henry Eberhart, my God, what is he doing? Yeah. What did I do in my undergraduate? Double major Native American Studies and Environmental Studies. He and his classmates are discussing the IPCC report. What did I do in my undergraduate? What good reason to have hope? Uh, uh, I join Dr. Jorgensen in recognizing the profound problem that is the ecological crisis, this ecocide that we are in. And I join her in recognizing the profound importance, the need, the utter need for interreligious engagement. You said that there has been no time that we need it more than today, and I agree with you fully. And I agree with you. Let me add to that reasoning, and I speak with interreligious engagement in mind. The environmental crisis, as you saw with Dr. Jorgensen's slide list of many different ways that the environmental crisis has been described, it's been attributed to many different problems. Capitalism, for the urbanization of the world, and but I don't find any of these particular materialistic explanations sufficient. Capitalism, a common suspect, is well, communism is not better than capitalism. Communism has been equally bad for the environment as capitalism. Rather, I join the Islamic philosopher Sayyid Hussein Nasr, what he says in the 1960s. I fully agree with him in his tracing the environmental crisis to a spiritual crisis. The environmental crisis is rooted in the desacralization of the cosmos, in the secularization of the cosmos. No longer the cosmos having its own objective spiritual integrity, but now a machine. If anybody knows the philosophy of science, Cartesian philosophy, Francis Bacon, the father of the experimental method, who said that in Pierre Hadot's paraphrasing, that nature best unveils her mysteries through the torture of experimentation. This is the scientific method, the founding of the scientific method. You see a new species in the ocean, what do? You take it out of its species, out of its environment, and you dissect it. You do not say a prayer, you do not write a poem, you do not contemplate in that way, in what Pierre Hadot would call an Orphic way of contemplation. But my minutes here are very few, so let me go on. The environmental crisis is rooted in a spiritual crisis and an intellectual crisis. I could comment further, but in the interest of time, this spiritual crisis, to respond to it, we are in need of a spiritual response. And no matter what environmental engineering we can put together, we can innovate, it is not thorough enough, not deep enough of a response. Recycling is bad for the environment. The recycling industry necessitates the use of highways, of gasoline, if not gasoline, electric cars, batteries, but it is relatively good. We have greenwashed modern technology to think that it is good for the environment if we use it in a particular way. It does not ultimately resolve the environmental crisis. If we all recycled, we all drove Teslas or whatever, whatnot, we would still have an ecological crisis, an environmental crisis. Not until we recognize the sacred profundity of the environment can we resolve it, in my opinion. And we are in need of recourse thus to spiritual responses. Now, to my mind, in essence, that would need a resacralization of the cosmos with knowledge, and thus the rediscovery of indigenous modes of knowing the environment, shamanic sciences, traditional Chinese sciences, Islamic sciences, all that see the world in the light of the sacred, that orient toward the sacred in an objective, not just a poetic I mean, poetry can be objective, of course, or not in a superstitious way. Now, but what else does religion offer? Religion offers the teaching of virtues. And here Dr. Jorgensen has shed light on the virtue of hope, hope as a virtue. I'm reminded one of the most central teachings, you'll hear this often in Friday khutbahs, Friday sermons in mosques when it comes to hope, the teaching of the Bedouin visiting the Prophet Muhammad and the Prophet asking, so a Bedouin visiting the Prophet Muhammad, the Prophet asked the Bedouin, what have you done with your camel? And the Bedouin has said, I have left my camel out in the hands of God. That is, I have not tethered my camel. It's roaming. I have just trusted God that when I go out, I'll find my camel outside. The Prophet responds, tether your camel and have hope in God. So, yes. So both. And then Rumi masterfully, it is in this polyvalent teaching, masterfully teaches one to tether one's camel with the hope of God, which is a whole other matter. Now, as well, and the salient Islamic teaching on hope is practically any Islamic sermon on hope would entail the invocation of the verse لا تقنطوا or the portion of a verse لا تقنطوا من رحمة الله, the Quranic verse, do not despair of God's mercy. Why? Why should we not despair of God's mercy? And why should we both tether our camel and have hope in God? Why not just tether our camel? And so the Bedouin had one way of thinking. I would say today we're more inclined towards tethering our camels and not necessarily having hope in God. And having hope in God in the Islamic world, and I would say even outside, is meant to be, in the teachings that I've been exposed to, an active matter. Hope is not just, so in a sense, hope is not just a noun, but also a verb, to hope, not to have hope passively, but to hope actively. You hold on to the rope of God. It's a Quranic image, the rope of God. And what do you do with the rope of God, with a rope? What do? You hold on very intensely. You're passive and you fall. It's an active matter. So, why have hope in God? Why is it not enough to tether our camel? We have, at risk of going beyond just my very few minutes looking at Dean Roberts, but no, very quickly. It's exciting, is it not? It's worth it, yes? All right. All right. So we live in the present moment. The past is something else. Let me not talk about the past, but we remember the past. We know the past. It does not exist anymore, but we know it through memory and its traces in the present. There's more to be said, but let's put that aside. The future also does not exist, not yet. And we do not know it. We are not certain about the future will hold. And in fact, the only thing that is certain about the future is our uncertainty about it. That's the only thing we could be certain about concerning the future, is that we're uncertain about it. Or one among our few certainties about the future. While the divine is utterly transcendent, the divine is not the divine is not constrained by time. One and independent of all the world of multiplicity, all the world of manyness, the divine is not constrained by time. The divine is both in Islamic teaching, and I would venture to say outside of Islamic teaching as well, both transcendent and immanent. Speaking of immanence, divine is present here in the Quranic teaching. In Quranic teachings, God is closer to you than your jugular vein. And wherever you turn, there is the face of God. These are Quranic verses. So the divine is immanent, but the divine, that's the immanent divine is also transcendent. God is also transcendent. God is beyond past, present, and future. And in that, I put forward is a great mercy for us, a great gift to us, and a great reason to have hope. Because, and yes, in it, in that fact, in that Islamic teaching and beyond Islamic as well, we have reason to have hope, which is that in the face of uncertainty concerning tomorrow, which is why we also have so much eco grief, so to speak. What will happen in 20 years? Do I have children? Should I get married and have children? What will happen to my grandchildren? In the face of that eco grief, to have recourse to certainty. In the face of uncertainty, to have recourse to certainty. And that is what hope does. That is what hope is. In the face of uncertainty of tomorrow, it turns us towards the certainty of the divine center that is both within and beyond. And the fact that it is beyond gives us much reason to have hope, because there is great joy in knowing that the transcendent is, there's great joy in knowing that the transcendent is beyond. Because once we have fallen into the deep abyss of ecocide, it takes one who is outside of the abyss to throw in a rope with which we could climb. And surely the rope of God is a sturdy rope. Thank you, Dr. Jorgensen, Dr. Eberhart.
Well, thanks to all of you. We have time for a couple of questions from audience here or online.
Hello. I'm sure as you were teaching undergrads, and you've been in class with me, you've kind of probably run into the problem of a student who is a non-believer, who is also grappling with the ecological crisis and the corresponding grief. I am curious about what you think liturgies might look like for those unchurched or those students who might find the language of faith or the language of God to be not so comforting.
It's a great question. Most of the students in my classroom would fall into that category of non-religious and certainly not Christian. What I always find so interesting is oftentimes students who don't have religious backgrounds also don't have as much religious baggage and often come to class a little bit more inclined to listen and explore. So it's just a totally different conversation. But I think there's a lot, there's threads that are shared between a lot of different outlooks, orientations, philosophies with different religious traditions. And I think that's, we were just at dinner talking about, as an instructor, it's a problem to think about a lot of indigenous practices as religious for a lot of reasons. And so that's one example of how do we think about what are some shared questions, epistemological frameworks that we're wanting to shake up and interrogate aside from religious claims. And I think if we think about any religion is always functioning with some philosophical framework, and everyone gets to come to the table of discussing those things, values that aren't attached to a particular doctrinal tradition or even religion per se. So I think that's one of the ways we get at that is by backing that up. And for the religious people in the room, what are some of those presumed values and what are some of those structures that we're using to even have the conversation? Does that help? Yeah. Yeah.
I have a stake in the game personally. So.
Yeah. Yeah. Obviously it goes without saying, you don't need religion to care about the environment, but
way to respond to that isn't accessible to
I'm very curious about what a non-theistic kind of planetary liturgy might look
Mhm.
for.
Yeah, I think we see it at youth-led protests. I have. It's liturgy. And that's part of the problem with these really narrow ideas of liturgy and part of what I'm wanting to kind of crack open when it comes to the Christian context. What counts? Why shouldn't the 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 voices of my students who are writing beautiful lyrics and bringing their guitars and their ukuleles and marching down Division in Northfield, that's liturgy. Mhm. Yeah. Thanks for your question.
Another question? Or are there any Zoomers, Olu, who have asked a question? We must be at time.
Or an offering,
Hmm.
an insight anyone wants to share.
The takeaway for me tonight, well, there's several, but I love the picture of the Advent wreath and the candles and the colors, and made me think about how some congregations, maybe many, I don't know, do blue Christmas. And that just always
Yeah.
feels a little like outside or separate from, or like, oh, that's for those people.
Mm.
And I'm interested in maybe any of your ideas about ritual that incorporates the lament into what is very standard and conventional, and but with just a bit of change, tapping into the grief and the tears.
Yeah, and I love Carvalhes on this. Ritual at World End at World's End is an amazing resource, and ritual is such a great way to study religion. I mean, my students love thinking about ritual because it just you have different different modes of thinking about what religion does, what religion exists for in the first place. But the example with Advent and the candles, I mean, the reason I came to this knowledge recently, I didn't know about Gaudete. I had no idea that there was this historical precedent of Advent being about grief and lament before this turn to Christian hope. And so I think there's some work to be done in plumbing what exists in liturgies of old across traditions. And then I like Meta's use of kind of hyper localizing that. And what does that mean for us here in this place? I've been learning a lot from Indigenous leaders locally about watershed liturgy. I've done a little writing and thinking about this. And what do water protectors in this area have to say about things like baptism? How does that change how we enact some of those sacramental rituals in that case? So yeah, I think there's a way to tap into liturgies of old, rituals of old, and not throw it all out, but critically return to some of that and think about it in a local way. And as I said, or I tried to tonight, really center particular voices in the crafting of those liturgies and the enacting of them.
Allison Schwartz on Zoom said, I found your connections between apocalypse and Advent really meaningful as I started sermon writing today. I will definitely be adapting it, box breathing for worship in my church. Thank you, a local UMC pastor.
Thanks, Allison. That's great. Love hearing that.
All right. Well, thank you, Kiara, again, Dr. Jorgensen, so much. Thank you, Dr. Timothy Eberhart. Thank you, Dr. Munjed Murad. Thank you all for coming, and those of online as well for this very important discussion tonight. Bless you.
Whoa.